She told everyone at the party that this was her house, standing in my kitchen, wearing my mother's pearls, calling my guests our friends. Not once, not as a slip of the tongue, not in a moment of confusion. My younger sister Linda stood there with a wine glass in her hand, gesturing around the living room I had spent 43 years making a home, and announced to strangers that she and her husband Frank had finally found their dream place. The dream place was mine. The mortgage was mine. The name on every deed, every utility bill, every piece of mail was mine. But nobody at that party would have known it from the way she spoke. I stood in the hallway, hands clutching a tray of appetizers I'd been instructed to refill, watching my sister play hostess in my own home. At 66, I thought I'd learned every flavor of betrayal life could serve. I buried a husband. I raised 2 children who moved across the country and forgot my birthday 3 years running. I survived cancer, a car accident, and the particular loneliness that settles into a house after the person who made it warm is gone. But this was a new lesson in how the people closest to you can make you disappear while you're still standing right in front of them. The party had been Linda's idea. Just a small gathering, she'd said 2 weeks earlier, perched on my kitchen counter as if she owned it. To celebrate our fresh start. You don't mind, do you, Dorothy? She didn't wait for an answer. She never did. Within days, she'd sent invitations, hired a caterer I couldn't afford, and rearranged my furniture to open up the flow. When I suggested maybe a smaller event, Frank patted my shoulder like I was a confused child and said, "Don't worry, Dot. We've got this under control. Under control." That phrase had become the soundtrack of the past 6 months, ever since they'd arrived at my door with 3 suitcases and a story about a flood that destroyed their rental. The flood in Riverside, they said. All their belongings, gone. Insurance wouldn't cover it. They had nowhere else to go. Could they stay, just temporarily, until they got back on their feet? I'm a sister. I'm a human being. Of course I said yes. What I didn't know then was that there had been no flood. I would learn that later, much later, after the damage was done. What had actually happened was a foreclosure, not from bad luck, but from Frank's gambling habit that Linda had hidden from everyone, including herself. But that first night, standing on my porch with suitcases and tears, they seemed like victims, and I was raised to help victims. The first month was fine, almost pleasant. Linda cooked dinners. Frank fixed the loose railing on the back steps. They thanked me constantly, promised they'd be out by Christmas, talked about apartment hunting. I gave them the guest room, cleared space in the closet, made them feel welcome because that's what family does. But somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd month, the gratitude began to evaporate, replaced by something far more comfortable for them and far more uncomfortable for me. Entitlement. It started small. Linda reorganizing my pantry because it's more efficient this way. Frank changing the thermostat without asking because you keep it too cold. The remote control migrating to their room, my favorite coffee mug disappearing into their private stash. I told myself these were minor things, adjustments people make when living together. I told myself I was being petty. I told myself a lot of lies that year. Then Linda got a job at a dental office, part-time, decent pay. Frank started doing consulting work, though I never saw him consult with anyone except the sports channels on my television. I assumed they were saving money to move out. I was wrong. They were saving money to redecorate. My living room curtains, the ones Richard and I bought on our anniversary trip to Charleston, came down one Saturday while I was at the grocery store. When I came home, Linda was hanging modern blinds. Much cleaner aesthetic, she said, not looking at me. The curtains were in a trash bag by the curb. I didn't say anything. I wish I had. Silence, I've learned, is permission to those who want to take more. By month 4, they'd stopped mentioning moving out entirely. When I gently asked about their apartment search, Frank laughed. Rent prices are insane right now, We'd be throwing money away. You understand. I didn't understand. I owned my house outright. I didn't need their rent. I needed my space. But I didn't say that either. Instead, I nodded and retreated to my bedroom. the only room in the house that still felt like mine. The shift from guests to occupiers happened so gradually, I couldn't point to a single moment when everything changed. It was more like watching a tide come in, slow and steady, until suddenly you're standing in water up to your knees and wondering when you stopped noticing it rising. Linda began inviting her friends over without asking. Frank started parking his truck in the garage, forcing my car onto the driveway where it collected tree sap and bird droppings. My mail was opened, sorted, and sometimes accidentally thrown away. When I protested, Linda sighed with that particular exhaustion reserved for dealing with unreasonable people. "We're trying to help, Dorothy. You're so disorganized." I wasn't disorganized. I'd been managing my own home for 4 decades. But Linda had a way of saying things that made you question your own memory, your own competence. Gaslighting. My daughter Jessica called it when I finally mentioned it during one of her rare phone calls. "Mom, you need to set boundaries," she said, distracted by something on her end. Easy advice from 2,000 miles away. Harder to implement when you're standing in your own kitchen being told you're holding the spatula wrong. The party idea emerged during dinner one evening, presented not as a question but as a fait accompli. "We're throwing a housewarming party," Linda announced, twirling pasta on her fork. 3 weeks from Saturday, Frank and I want to introduce ourselves to the neighborhood properly, build community. I blinked. "This is my house, Linda. I know the neighborhood." She waved her hand dismissively. "You've been a hermit since Richard died. People probably think the house is abandoned. This will be good for you. Get you socializing again." Frank nodded along, already scrolling through his phone for catering options they couldn't afford. Options I would end up paying for, though I didn't know it yet. I should have said no. The old Dorothy, the one who raised 2 teenagers and ran a tight ship at the county clerk's office for 27 years, would have said no. But grief had softened me in ways I hadn't recognized. Loneliness had made me pliable, and family, that loaded word, had made me feel obligated to absorb their needs while ignoring my own. The week before the party, my house became a construction zone. Linda hired cleaners, though my house was already clean. She rented furniture to supplement the dated pieces in my living room. She brought in a bartender, a DJ, a photographer. When I saw the bill, my stomach dropped. I pulled her aside. "Linda, this is too expensive. I can't afford this." She laughed, actually laughed. "Oh, Dorothy, don't be dramatic. Think of it as an investment. Besides, Frank and I are covering the alcohol. You're only paying for food and service, only." As if $2,000 was pocket change. As if I hadn't spent my savings carefully, knowing I was living on a fixed income. As if my financial security was less important than her social debut. I paid it. I paid it because she'd already committed, already invited people, already created a situation where saying no would make me look cheap, difficult, unreasonable. I paid it and resented every dollar, and wondered when I'd become so small in my own life. The night of the party, I watched my home fill with strangers. Linda greeted them at my door, hugged them in my entryway, directed them to my food and my furniture as if she'd manifested it all into existence herself. She wore a dress I'd never seen, jewelry I recognized as my mother's, perfume that cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Frank stood beside her, proud and proprietary, shaking hands and making jokes about their place. Nobody introduced me. I was a ghost in my own home. At one point, I overheard Linda talking to a couple near the fireplace. "We just love it here," she was saying. "It took forever to find the right place, but the moment we walked in, we knew it felt like home." The couple nodded, admiring the mantel, the built-in bookshelves Richard had installed himself, the family photos Linda had rearranged to include more of herself and fewer of me. "You're so lucky," the woman said. "Houses like this don't come available often." Linda smiled, that secret, satisfied smile of someone who'd pulled off a magic trick. "We certainly are." Standing there in the hallway, holding my tray of appetizers that nobody noticed, I felt something inside me finally shift. Not anger, not yet. Something colder, clarity. The same clarity I'd felt years ago when I realized my marriage, for all its good years, had also contained Richard's affairs. The same clarity that came when I understood my children's phone calls would always be brief and obligatory. The clarity that arrives when you stop lying to yourself about what you already know. My sister and her husband weren't guests. They were occupiers, and they had no intention of leaving, ever. I set down the tray and walked quietly to my bedroom. Behind the door, I pulled out the metal lockbox from the top shelf of my closet. Inside were the documents I'd organized years ago when Richard got his first cancer diagnosis: the will, the deed, insurance policies, bank statements, my name, clear and unambiguous on every page. I ran my fingers over the property deed, feeling the embossed seal. This house was mine, legally, completely, undeniably mine. And it was time I reminded certain people of that fact. I didn't return to the party. I sat on my bed, listening to the noise filter through the walls, laughter and music and Linda's voice rising above it all, confident and commanding in a space she'd stolen. But I wasn't defeated. I was planning. Because clarity, once it arrives, has a way of sharpening everything that follows. The next morning, I did something I should have done months earlier. I called a lawyer, not the family attorney who'd handled Richard's estate, someone Linda might think to charm or manipulate, but someone new, someone who dealt specifically with property law and tenant disputes. Her name was Margaret Chen, and her voice on the phone was crisp, professional, and blessedly unsympathetic to sob stories. "Tell me what's happening," she said. So I did. I told her about the flood that never happened, about the foreclosure I'd discovered by accident when a collections letter arrived at my house in Frank's name. I told her about 6 months of increasing occupation, of boundaries eroded, of my home becoming theirs while I became invisible. I told her about the party, about Linda's performance as homeowner, about my mother's pearls that Linda had taken from my jewelry box without asking. When I finished, there was a pause. Then Margaret said, "How soon do you want them out?" The question, simple and direct, nearly broke me. "As soon as legally possible, then let's begin." The process was surprisingly straightforward, because Linda and Frank had never signed a lease, never paid rent, never had any formal agreement. They were considered guests, not tenants. In my state, that meant I could ask them to leave with 30 days written notice. If they refused, I could pursue formal eviction. Margaret drafted the letter that afternoon. It arrived by certified mail 2 days later. I made sure to be home when it was delivered. I wanted to see their faces. Linda opened the envelope at the kitchen table, Frank reading over her shoulder. I watched from the doorway, coffee cup in hand, steadier than I'd felt in months. Her expression moved through several stages: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally, something close to fear. "You're evicting us?" Her voice pitched high, incredulous. "Your own sister?" "I'm asking you to leave my home," I corrected. "You said you needed temporary help. 6 months is enough time to find permanent housing." Frank stood, his bulk suddenly menacing in a way I hadn't allowed myself to notice before. "This is bullshit, Dot. We've put work into this place. We've improved it. You've occupied it," I said calmly. "Without my permission, you've redecorated, hosted parties, and presented my home as your own. That ends now." Linda's eyes filled with tears, real or performed. I couldn't tell anymore. "We're family," she whispered. "How can you do this to family?" The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Family was supposed to mean loyalty, support, unconditional love. But I'd learned that family could also mean exploitation, entitlement, cruelty, disguised as closeness. "Family doesn't lie about floods," I said quietly. "Family doesn't steal. Family doesn't erase. You have 30 days. The next month was tense, ugly, filled with slammed doors and hissed accusations. Linda tried everything: tears, rage, silent treatment, attempts to rally our extended family against me. She called me selfish, cruel, heartless. She told our cousins I was putting her on the street. She posted vague, martyred messages on social media about betrayal and blood being thicker than water, accompanied by sad face emojis. Some people believed her. Some people called me, asking if I couldn't be more flexible, more understanding. I listened politely and said the same thing to everyone. They're welcome to share their side. I'm sharing mine. Make your own judgment. Frank was angrier but simpler. He stopped speaking to me entirely, which was honestly a relief. He spent the 30 days looking at apartments he claimed he couldn't afford while spending money on lottery tickets and bar tabs. I know because I found the receipts in my trash can, the one they still used, as if it were theirs. When moving day finally arrived, they left with maximum drama. Linda made a show of taking every gift she'd ever given me, a picture frame, a set of dish towels, a ceramic vase. I won't leave my things in a house where I'm not wanted, she announced. I didn't point out that none of those things were particularly meaningful to me. I let her take them. Small prices for reclaiming my space. What she didn't take were my mother's pearls. I'd retrieved those weeks earlier, after the party, and locked them in my safe deposit box at the bank. When Linda noticed they were missing and accused me of hiding them, I simply said, "They're mine. I'm keeping them safe." Her fury was spectacular but pointless. By then, I'd changed my locks, updated my will, and made it crystal clear to everyone who mattered that Linda and Frank were no longer welcome in my home under any circumstances. The house felt enormous after they left. Empty in a way it hadn't been, even after Richard died. But it was a clean emptiness, like a wound that's been flushed and bandaged properly. It would heal better now. I walked through each room, touching things that were finally mine again. The thermostat, set to my preferred temperature, the remote control, back on the coffee table, my curtains, which I'd retrieved from a second-hand store, and rehung myself. The house smelled like my lavender sachets again, not Linda's aggressive vanilla candles. The quiet was mine. The space was mine. The future, uncertain but authentic, was mine. 3 months later, I heard through a cousin that Linda and Frank had split up. The gambling problem, once hidden, had apparently become impossible to ignore without my house as a buffer. Linda moved in with a friend. Frank went back to his mother's place. Neither contacted me, and I didn't reach out. Some relationships, I'd learned, survive best at a distance, or not at all. My children called after hearing about the eviction, finally, belatedly concerned. Jessica was supportive. "Good for you, Mom. You should have kicked them out sooner." Michael was judgmental. "Family is supposed to help each other." I told him he was welcome to host Linda himself. He declined. Now, sitting in my living room with my coffee and my book and my mother's pearls back in their proper drawer, I think about the women who might be listening to this story. The ones who've made themselves small to accommodate others. The ones who've been told that boundaries are selfishness, that asserting needs is cruelty, that keeping what's yours is greed. I want them to know something I learned too late. Your life doesn't belong to people just because they're related to you. Your home isn't theirs because they've decided it is. Your peace isn't negotiable currency to purchase their approval. I gave Linda 6 months I didn't owe her. I gave her patience, money, space, and tolerance. What I didn't give her, finally, was my dignity. That I kept, and in keeping it, I found something I'd thought I'd lost. Myself, the Dorothy who'd built a life, raised a family, survived grief, and didn't need anyone's permission to claim the space that had always been hers. If you're in a situation like mine, if you're the ghost in your own home, let me tell you gently but firmly, you have the right to exist fully in your own life. You have the right to say no, to set limits, to ask people to leave, even if they're family. Especially if they're family. Because the people who truly love you won't ask you to disappear. And the ones who do aren't worth the space they're taking.